Beyond the deadly contest and faceless villains, Squid Game revealed something more interesting and more recognizable: debt and desperation in a system designed to profit off both. Strip away the games and masks, and what you have is an entire nation stuck in an invisible competition, where failure means ruin. 1. Behind the mask, the real stakes of debt in South Korea. Behind the glow of South Korea's neon skylines and the prestige of its global technology brands was a quieter reality, one less celebrated and far more widespread. Beneath the surface of rapid development lived a crisis many carried but few discussed openly. Debt had evolved from a manageable burden into a structural condition, one that shaped the daily lives of millions across all age groups. The numbers were staggering. South Korea had one of the highest household debt-to-income ratios among developed nations. The Bank of Korea reported that household debt had exceeded the country's total annual GDP. For most, this statistic was not just a headline, it was a permanent condition. One 26-year-old in Seoul explained how he juggled 3 jobs while attending night classes, all to manage the interest from education loans he had taken years earlier. He lived on convenience store noodles, slept in short shifts, and rarely paused long enough to reflect. Failure was not an option, because his parents had placed everything they had on his shoulders. The pressure often began long before adulthood. Parents, hoping to give their children a competitive edge in education, enrolled them in expensive after-school academies known as hackwons. Monthly fees for these programs often pushed families into credit card debt or unsecured loans. When those children reached university, tuition brought new costs. Many took on private student loans with high interest rates and entered adult life already in a financial hole. Even stable employment did not guarantee relief. In cities like Seoul, housing prices continued to climb beyond what average incomes we could support. Young couples borrowed heavily just to secure a small apartment. When banks tightened lending, people turned to private lenders with aggressive terms and dangerous consequences. Life became a month-to-month calculation, with each paycheck already spoken for. Public messaging celebrated progress, success, and the nation's resilience. Yet behind closed doors, the weight of debt fractured families, drained mental health, and in some cases, led to irreversible decisions. These were not isolated struggles. They were repeated patterns across neighborhoods and generations. For many, life no longer felt like a fair pursuit of success. It felt like a game where the rules had already been written, and losing meant more than disappointment. It meant devastation. And when fiction begins to resemble reality this closely, the warning is no longer abstract, it is already here. 2. How a fictional game show exposed a national crisis. When Squid Game premiered, global audiences were immediately drawn to its suspense, shocking visuals, and high-stakes tension. However, behind the violent competitions and stylized brutality, the series presented a deeper narrative, one rooted in the harsh realities of South Korea's economic landscape. It was not only a dramatic survival story, it was a sharp social commentary on the consequences of unchecked debt and structural inequality. At the heart of the show was a simple yet devastating idea. Individuals so overwhelmed by debt willingly returned to a deadly game, fully aware of the risks, because their lives outside the competition had already become unbearable. This choice reflected a disturbing reality in modern South Korea, where millions faced mounting financial pressure, precarious employment, and limited avenues for relief. It was not that people sought danger, but that they had been backed into situations where every option carried consequences. Each character in the series represented a distinct segment of society. Gi-hun stood in for laid-off workers and the economically displaced, individuals once stable but now caught in a downward spiral of unemployment and personal failure. Sang-woo embodied those who had conformed to societal expectations, pursued education, and maintained status, only to find that merit alone no longer guaranteed stability. Seba-byok, a defector from North Korea, illustrated the marginalization of migrants and political outsiders. At the same time, Ali exposed the silent exploitation of foreign laborers who remained largely invisible within the national conversation. The show's design choices were equally deliberate. The oversized, colorful sets mimicked playgrounds, creating a visual link to innocence and childhood. However, this surface nostalgia sharply contrasted with the lethal games taking place inside. The surreal architecture, including winding staircases and illogical layouts, conveyed a loss of order and a sense of disorientation. These elements reflected the mental and emotional chaos experienced by those struggling under relentless financial strain. The masked VIPs, seated above the arena and detached from the players' suffering, served as a chilling metaphor for the elite. They watched with casual detachment, placing bets and enjoying the spectacle. Their presence illustrated how wealth insulated some from consequence, allowing them to benefit from a system that crushed others through symbolism, casting, and visual language. Squid Game translated economic despair into a fictional narrative that was both entertaining and brutally honest. It captured the lived experience of a society where debt had become inescapable and survival itself felt like a competition. 3. The players. Who's really in the game? When audiences watched Squid Game, something unsettling stood out. The players did not feel like strangers, they felt familiar. Every face, every backstory mirrored someone viewers had seen before. These were not abstract characters built for fiction. They were reflections of real people living in South Korea's debt crisis. Each contestant carried the burden of an entire social group shaped by circumstance and pulled into financial ruin. Without a safety net, Gi-hun represented a generation of displaced workers, once employed in manufacturing during South Korea's industrial rise. Many like him were pushed aside as industries evolved. When layoffs came, so did desperation. Gi-hun had no savings, no plan, and no future in sight. His gambling was not a thrill, it was a last resort. Thousands of Koreans in his age group now survive by borrowing, chasing odds, and living with the consequences. Sang-woo was a different story with the same ending. He attended a top university, earned praise, and climbed the professional ladder. However, that climb did not lead to stability. Pressure to succeed turned into fear of failure. After risky financial moves and mounting debt, he fell hard. For many educated South Koreans, degrees no longer guarantee security. The system promised success but delivered relentless competition and impossible expectations. Setsa Byok told a quieter story. As a North Korean defector, her options were limited. Trust was hard to find, and legal status brought more questions than answers. Like many defectors, she worked in the shadows. She tried to hold her family together without access to stable jobs, loans, or protection. Her experience echoed the silent struggles of those who crossed borders but still remained outsiders. Ali's story felt brutally familiar to migrant workers. He worked long hours, followed the rules, and believed loyalty would be enough. Instead, he was betrayed by those in power. In South Korea, foreign labor powers essential industries. Yet many migrant workers face wage theft, unsafe conditions, and crushing isolation. With no real support system, their debts grow while their rights remain ignored. Even Oh Il-nam, the elderly participant, represented a harsh truth. South Korea's senior poverty rate ranks among the highest globally. Many elderly citizens continue working menial jobs to survive. Retirement has become a luxury, not a guarantee. These characters were chosen carefully. Their stories felt real because they were. Each one reflected how deep and wide the debt trap had become. For debt, despair, and a culture of shame in South Korea, debt did not only represent a financial issue, it carried emotional weight, social consequences, and a deeply personal sense of failure. While many countries dealt with rising household debt, South Korea stood apart because of how debt was experienced, internalized, and hidden. The crisis was not always visible, but its effects ran deep. Borrowing money on the surface appeared like a simple solution. However, for many South Koreans, taking out a loan felt like admitting defeat. Social pressure rewarded stability, discipline, and achievement. Falling into debt meant failing to meet those standards, and that failure was not seen as individual. It reflected on the family as a whole. People did not talk about their financial problems. They carried them quietly, believing that silence was a form of protection. The country's suicide statistics revealed the cost of that silence. South Korea recorded one of the highest suicide rates among developed nations. The victims came from every background: students under pressure, small business owners crushed by losses, and elderly individuals with no financial support. Final letters often mentioned unpaid bills, failed ventures, or shame too heavy to carry. Bankruptcy was available by law, but it was rarely used. The stigma was strong. Declaring bankruptcy was viewed as an announcement of personal collapse, a label that could follow someone for years. Family expectations had always played a significant role. Parents felt responsible for their children's education, housing, and weddings. Children felt obligated to repay that investment with success. When those expectations fell apart, people often chose to borrow rather than admit they could not keep up. Many families lived under a shared burden of debt, with each member contributing to payments and hiding their struggles from the others. This unspoken pressure shaped daily life. Although it did not appear in laws or policies, it significantly influenced how people made decisions, avoided conversations, and presented themselves to others. Outwardly, they looked composed. Privately, they were overwhelmed. Shame worked quietly, tightening its grip with every missed payment and unanswered call. By the time the problem surfaced, it had often gone far beyond numbers. Debt had become personal. The silence surrounding it had already taken its toll. 5. The VIP's wealth, power, and the rigged system at first glance. Squid Game presented itself as a contest between desperate people chasing one last chance at survival. The focus remained on the players, their backstories, their choices, and their struggles. Yet behind every decision, every twist, and every death, there was another layer, one that operated quietly above it all. The VIPs did not enter the game. They watched, observed, bet, and indulged. Their presence shifted the entire narrative from a survival game to something far more disturbing in South Korea. That layer was not fiction. It mirrored a real system where wealthy individuals were insulated from consequences, and power rarely came with accountability. The country's economic transformation created global corporations, high-speed innovation, and a reputation for excellence. But behind that success was a growing divide. The upper class, often connected through inherited wealth or corporate influence, operated in a space entirely separate from ordinary life. Corruption scandals involving chaebols, South Korea's powerful family-owned conglomerates, were not rare events. CEOs were convicted, pardoned, and returned to power in a cycle that suggested the rules were different at the top. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens who failed under financial pressure faced bankruptcy, eviction, or worse. The system offered no parachute for them. In the world outside Squid Game, as in the show, the elite remained untouchable. The VIPs in the series symbolized this separation. They were not just rich. They were insulated, entertained by human suffering, and completely disconnected from the stakes involved. They placed bets on the outcomes of the games, turning survival into a spectacle. Their faces were hidden, their identities protected, and their influence absolute. For them, the game was never about desperation. It was about control. In real life, class stratification in South Korea shaped everything from housing access to education opportunities. The elites sent their children abroad, bought luxury apartments in cash, and secured positions through networks closed to outsiders. For everyone else, advancement was a gamble with far worse odds. Merit existed, but only when supported by access, connections, and timing. The illusion of fairness is 6 beyond fiction. Real life, Squid Game debt stories. Long before anyone uttered the first line of dialogue in Squid Game, South Korea had already become a pressure chamber of quiet desperation. Beneath the surface of a booming economy and sleek technological progress, stories of silent collapse unfolded every day. The system tracked debt not through microphones or heat signatures, but through interest rates, missed payments, and mounting obligations logged in cold databases. Lives were not monitored with hidden cameras, but with automated calls, bank notices, and relentless credit evaluations. Take, for instance, the delivery rider in Seoul who worked 16-hour days with no insurance, no security, and no way out. He had borrowed money to cover his mother's hospital bills and later took another loan to repair his scooter. Each repayment led to another cost. By the time he turned 30, every paycheck was already spoken for, carved into slices owed to private lenders. There was no breathing room, no reset button, only the next delivery and the growing weight of invisible chains. In another district, a once successful restaurant owner watched her business wither during the pandemic. Rent remained due, suppliers demanded payment. Government relief came too late, and loan sharks filled the gap. The restaurant closed, but the debt did not. Her home, her savings, even her daughter's education fund. Everything became collateral in a game she had never agreed to play. Students, too, found themselves entangled. Private education promised a better future, but it came with fees far beyond family income. Many turned to shadow lenders, offering quick cash with quiet interest rates that doubled before graduation. By the time they received their degrees, they carried burdens heavier than the promise of employment could offset. These were not isolated tragedies. They were patterns, each one recorded in spreadsheets, categorized by profession, location, and risk score. People believed they were making choices. What they did not always see was that the system had already predicted their paths. Every late payment flagged a vulnerability. Every desperate loan created a new data point. Unlike the players in Squid Game, there were no red suits or glass bridges. There were bank forms, rejection emails, and months of silence. The rules of the game were never explained. The stakes were real. And in the end, survival was not rewarded with cash, but simply the chance to keep playing another day. 7. What drives the debt? Housing, education, and consumer pressure. It always started with a goal. People wanted a place to live, a school to attend, and products to own. In modern South Korea, these were not extravagant dreams because they were seen as necessities. At least, that was how they were presented. A home represented not only shelter but also stability, status, and long-term security. Education offered more than knowledge because it promised access to opportunities. A job provided both income and dignity. Appearances carried weight, and every item and milestone came wrapped in pressure that often went unspoken. Housing prices rose far beyond reason, and apartments in cities like Seoul became unaffordable for average earners. Even small spaces required enormous down payments, so young couples borrowed from their parents, and those parents, in turn, borrowed from banks. Mortgage debt spread across generations, growing silently and steadily. These people were not buying luxury homes. They were simply trying to secure a future. However, the numbers continued climbing and the ground beneath them never stayed still. The further they went, the harder it became to stop. Private education became another financial trap. Public schools were available, but they were not considered sufficient. Hagwons or private academies, promised better grades, higher university acceptance rates, and more prestigious career paths. Families drained savings, cancelled plans, and delayed retirement just to keep up with the fees. Some relied on loans, while others sold property to pay for tuition. The system never directly forced them, yet it encouraged every sacrifice. Parents believed they were helping, although in reality, they were fueling a system that demanded more and never slowed down. Job stability offered little relief. The promise of long-term employment faded as younger generations moved through. Short-term contracts and unstable positions, wages stalled, and working hours increased. The fear of being replaced by automation or outsourcing created constant anxiety. People worked harder and longer, yet earned less. Social image added another burden. Social media amplified expectations. Phones, clothes, and lifestyle choices became public proof of success. People who fell behind felt ashamed, so they spent more to catch up. Many borrowed just to maintain appearances. This was not thoughtless spending, it was careful survival. Every debt felt necessary. Eventually, the dreams they chased, homes, education, careers, became the very weights pulling them down. They did not fall because they failed. They lost because the system was already broken, and playing along became their only remaining option. 8. Government role, help, or hypocrisy. On paper, the government appeared to be a stabilizing force. There were policies, programs, and carefully worded promises. Officials spoke of balance and support. They introduced youth loan schemes, affordable housing initiatives, and interest rate controls. Yet for the people on the ground, these measures often felt more symbolic than substantial. The gap between what was promised and what was delivered continued to widen. Youth loan programs were marketed as a lifeline. They were designed to give young adults a chance to build credit, pursue education, or start small businesses. However, the reality was more complicated. These loans came with limits, both in amount and accessibility. Interest rates remained high enough to create long-term burdens. Many recipients used the funds not for new opportunities but to cover existing debt. Instead of lifting people out, the programs often locked them in. Housing policy painted a similar picture. Rent control was announced, new housing projects were approved, yet prices still climbed, and availability remained limited. Middle-class families found themselves squeezed out of urban centers. First-time buyers saw every attempt at ownership pushed further out of reach. Government subsidies helped on the surface, but they rarely matched the scale of market inflation. The dream of home ownership, once a symbol of progress, became an illusion wrapped in bureaucracy. Criticism grew steadily louder. Citizens questioned whether policymakers truly understood the pressure ordinary people faced. Reforms felt reactive rather than proactive. Economic reports spoke in averages and forecasts, while real people dealt with bills, eviction notices, and calls from lenders. Transparency was minimal. When data was released, it often failed to explain how policies were helping those most affected. Debt restructuring options were available, but the process was slow and riddled with obstacles. Credit ratings dropped. Job opportunities vanished. Social stigma attached itself to those seeking relief. Instead of support, many borrowers encountered blame. The question was no longer whether the government noticed the crisis, it was whether they chose to act in ways that mattered. For many citizens, the answer felt painfully clear. They were told help was coming, yet help always arrived too late, too little or not at all. And while officials talked about recovery, millions continued falling, one missed payment at a time. Point 9. The ending that never came. Can the cycle be broken? From the outside, Squid Game ended with a clear decision. One player survived, claimed the prize, and walked out. Yet the moment the doors opened, the questions began. Nothing truly ended. The money was real, the memories were real, but the weight of it all stayed heavy. Even with everything finished, the system that created the game remained untouched. This is where fiction begins to feel like reality, because in the real world, there is no grand finale. There is no final round, no curtain call, and no moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Instead, people carry their debt, their trauma, and their regrets into the next day, the next year, and sometimes for the rest of their lives. The cycle continues not because people want it, but because it is built to continue. The rules are already written. The prices of homes, the pressure of school, the fear of losing a job, and the shame of falling behind all come from systems that reward competition but punish failure. It does not matter how hard someone works if the rules keep shifting against them. Squid Game hinted at rebellion. One player refused to spend the money, then tried to uncover the truth behind the game. It was not about revenge, it was about understanding. Someone had to ask why this happened and who allowed it to happen again. In the real world, systemic change would not come from winning a prize. It would mean changing the rules altogether. Affordable housing would not be a promise, it would be a right. Education would not lead to years of debt, but to opportunity. Work would not mean endless anxiety, but stability. The real test is whether society is ready to stop surviving and start questioning. Is anyone willing to ask who benefits when people are stuck in debt? Who profits from this fear, this stress, this race to keep up? Squid Game may have ended for one player, but for millions of real people, the game keeps going. The only way out is not through a prize. It is through pressure, awareness, and action. The real ending will not come with silence. It will come when the system is forced to listen. 10. Final reflection. When fiction becomes a mirror to clear, every society runs on rules. Some are written into law, while others live quietly in expectations. And for a while, people follow them, often without question. Work hard, stay quiet, pay your dues, trust the system. That is the story many grow up believing. Then comes a piece of fiction so precise, so close to lived experience, that it no longer feels like entertainment. Squid Game did not just depict desperation, it replicated it. Viewers did not just watch characters fall deeper into debt. They saw pieces of themselves reflected in those struggles. The lines between narrative and reality blurred. At first glance, it appeared to be just a game show gone violent. However, behind the costumes, the colorful sets, and the surreal challenges was something more. Each trial represented a choice stripped of dignity. Each decision exposed the cracks in a society driven by inequality, shame, and survival. The discomfort it created did not come from fiction. It came from truth pushed just far enough to be undeniable. When fiction becomes too accurate, people begin to ask different questions. Not about the plot, but about the world outside the screen. Why has debt become a life sentence for so many? Why are the vulnerable the first to be punished and the last to be heard? And who benefits when failure feels inevitable? The most potent aspect of Squid Game was not its twist or spectacle. It was its mirror. It dared to reflect a world many already recognized, but had been trained to accept. And once that reflection became clear, it became harder to look away. Art like this shifts something. It forces discomfort into the open. It turns silent struggles into shared conversations. And sometimes, it sparks resistance. Not the loud kind, but the quiet act of recognizing the game for what it is. No story can fix a broken system. Yet stories can reveal what that system fears most. People who stop playing along. People who ask where the rules came from and who truly needs them. Because when fiction begins to feel prophetic, it signals one thing. The cycle people thought was unbreakable has already started to crack. And that alone might be the beginning of something new. It played out like fiction. Yet every rule in the game reflected a system millions had already lived through. Structured, relentless, and unforgiving. So what does that say about the world outside the screen? Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember to like and subscribe for more.